A very common question we get is regarding whether or not somebody has been arrested. It's not a black and white issue, and there's a lot of gray area there. So it is important to understand when the actual arrest occurred, because it may trigger some other defenses and cause other problems with the government's case. So oftentimes people will come to us and they'll say that the officer told them that they weren't under arrest, even though the officer asked them to do a bunch of other stuff. And so technically they were under arrest. Just because the officer told them they weren't under arrest doesn't mean that they weren't under arrest. Generally speaking, the courts have said we have to consider a couple different factors. Now, there are a lot of different cases about this specific issue because it's a very important one. When is a person seized? When are they not free to do something? That's really what constitutes an arrest. And so these are the three factors that we look at predominantly. Every situation is a case-by-case basis, and you need to look at it throughout the litany of different Supreme Court cases that exist under the Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. But you want to look at a couple different things. One, what does a reasonable person think? So what would you, what would me, what would somebody who's a reasonable person in that position think under the circumstances? Do they think that they're under arrest? Do they think that they are lawfully entitled to leave that spot, or are they free to leave? Which leads to the next question. What is that person's freedom of movement? So would that reasonable person think that they're free to just leave? The officer had stopped them, they pulled them over, and they're just free to continue about their way. They're free to just leave. If they're free to leave, presumably there's no arrest, but in most situations, they're not. The other thing you want to consider is whether or not there's a lawful show of force or show of authority. Is the officer acting under the officer's ability to actually stop you? So if it's an officer just waving and saying hello and they're not kind of implicating any of their duties as an officer, that's different, right? So you may be feeling like you can't leave, but the officer's not using their force or not using their duty or their lawful authority as a police officer to actually stop you or get any control over the situation. But if that officer is saying, I'm an officer of the law, stop right there, put your hands up, would a reasonable person believe they were under arrest? Probably. Would a reasonable person believe that they are just free to leave? Probably not. And so even though the officer in that fact, hypothetical, didn't say you are under arrest, they did say stop, put your hands up, so they caused them to do something. They told them they're not free to leave, and they were exercising a show of force. They were using their force, their authority as an officer to curtail that person's movement. And so that's essentially where the arrest occurred. So you want to be careful about that, because when the arrest actually occurs, that might implicate other things. And so you want to, as the case develops, you want to say and look and see and identify when that arrest was, because if the arrest happened out of order, meaning they didn't have probable cause to complete that arrest, then that may be a basis for motions to exclude, motions to preclude certain evidence, and you can use that to your advantage. So why it's important? A couple different reasons. One, Miranda. So Miranda triggers when you're in custody, basically it's called custodial interrogation. So when you're not free to leave and you're being interrogated, they have to Mirandize you. Often that happens after an arrest, so you want to know when the arrest is. Okay, that may have some implications with Miranda. It's more complicated than that, but the reason why arrest is important is because Miranda may or may not be implicated based on your ability, you're being in custody or not. Same goes for the probable cause for arrest. So there's a certain hypothetical that we talk about often. It's when the police will stop somebody for DUI. They won't have enough cause to actually conduct the arrest. They'll ask that individual to move their car. So they'll give that person some instructions. They'll say, you're basically telling them you're not free to leave. You have to follow our instructions. Your ability, your freedom of movement is now curtailed, and you're under our authority. You're under our command to do that, to do something. So if that person was arrested before they had probable cause, that may have been an unlawful arrest. Same thing in Arizona. There's a lot of implied consent laws, and these different things will trigger only after an arrest. So if an arrest hasn't been made, none of those implied consent laws may actually come into play. So a complicated issue. It's not very black and white. There's a lot of case law. There's a lot of ambiguity here. And so generally speaking, these are the three different variables, the three different factors that we use to determine whether or not a person is actually under arrest. So just because an officer said, no, you're not under arrest, I'm just asking you to get in the back of my car, it's probably an arrest in your situation. So if you think this may be an issue in your case, if an officer was kind of giving you mixed messages, said you weren't under arrest, but you felt like you were under arrest, or they were asking you to do something that constituted a substantial limitation on your freedom to move, you may have actually been under arrest, whether you know it or not. So if you want to talk about that, if you're facing criminal charges and you want to speak about how this can impact your case or what some of the defenses might be, give our office a call. We offer free case evaluations, and we're happy to speak with you. Thanks for watching.